Reconstruction.
I hope everybody's okay with us recording the session this evening.
Yes, and we must say, before we get started, or before I continue, I am not representing NIH. Okay, the Reconstruction Judaism resolution included a call for all Reconstructionist movement congregations to engage in deep reflection on the ways in which we have participated in or benefited from racial injustices in our communities, and to answer this call of Torah to pursue justice and practice teshuvah by taking concrete steps to repair the harm. Now that the resolution has been adopted, we begin the process of deep reflection by welcoming Dr. Sarah Chandros Hull to present on reparations for Indigenous peoples, why now, why us, and what next. Sarah is she is a new member to our community. She's been here, she and Bob have been here about a year. She says she was drawn to Adat Shalom largely because of the work we've been undertaking to address structural racism. And she literally jumped, y'all, right into the Social Action Committee and the many conversations we've been having about reparations and sea change, although she thinks the whiskey tastings are a definite bonus. Professionally, Sarah works as a bioethicist. She earned her PhD in 1999 from the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health and has worked at the NIH for almost a quarter of a century, which I find unbelievable, specializing in addressing ethical issues related to genetic research. I say that because she looks so young. She is so young. I can't believe it. Her work has increasingly focused on addressing racial inequity in genomics and building the research capacities of U.S. tribal communities. A few highlights you might want: co-chair of the NHGRI National, what is the NHGRI?
The Genome Institute, you can say.
Mm-hmm. Racial and Ethnic Equity Plan Initiative, which focuses on diversification of the genomics workforce at NIH. She just completed a detail as a senior advisor to the NIH Tribal Health Research Office to support the development of ethical protection to communities engaged in tribal health research. And get this, y'all, she's a member of the newly formed White House National Science and Technology Council Subcommittee on Indigenous Knowledge. Did you hear that? She received the 2022 Director's Distinguished Service Award last year for her outstanding service to NHGRI, the entire NIH community, and to many groups beyond NIH. And Sarah and I know each other at work and in our community, and we have afternoon tea. We sometimes, and we talk about these things, about the tribal communities. We talk about reparations, and we just have wonderful conversations. Whenever Sarah sees something she thinks we might need for reparations, she sends me something. She'll invite me to meetings. So we're a big community, but it's nice to know I can walk over to the next building and she's there. So without further ado, Sarah, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I think you were one of the very first people I got to meet in person at Adat Shalom, and I know that has a whole lot to do with why I stayed. I'm really just so delighted to be part of this community and to be part of a movement that supports the study of reparations for both descendants of enslaved Africans and Indigenous peoples of North America. Last year at the movement-wide Day of Learning on reparations, Rabbi Jessica Rosenberg assured us that we don't have to know the outcome to begin the work of teshuvah. So with that in mind, let's get started. There we go. I only get to use this joke once with everyone. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Oops. That's good. Now let's see if I can advance. There we go. So the title of my presentation provides a roadmap for my plans with you this evening. After providing you with some background, I'll start by laying out a case for why I believe it's both essential and timely that we include Indigenous people in our discussions of reparations. That's the why now. And then I will tie that to why this is relevant to us as Jewish people in particular, why us. And then finally, I hope to leave us with a solid starting point for determining what kinds of concrete actions and next steps we as a congregation can take. What next? And I'm going to ask that you hold your questions for the pauses in between each of these sections of my presentation. If you have a burning one, just go ahead and put it in the chat. And I'll offer my thanks in advance to Jeff Rubin, who's kindly agreed to help me monitor the chat box for questions. So I'm going to spend a moment saying a bit more about who I am and who I'm not. Following in Jackie's footsteps, I am required under government ethics rules to make it clear that I'm speaking to you in my personal capacity and not as an employee or spokesperson in any way for the federal government. At the same time, I think it's important for me to be transparent about my professional identity, especially when we're talking about the rights and interests of people who are Indigenous to this country. I mean, in a way, I'm inherently part of the problem, and no matter how hard I may be working to fix those problems, you would be right to view my perspective with some caution. And I also want to acknowledge with much gratitude the entrustment that many of my Native colleagues have extended to me. These are very precious relationships, and I want to make sure I don't do anything that could jeopardize the progress that we've made together. Also, I'm speaking to you from the ancestral homelands of the Piscataway people, who are still here, as well as other Indigenous peoples about whom I still have a lot to learn. Whoops. It's known as by some people as the town of Boyds in Upper Montgomery County, Maryland. I'm a tallish woman with short burgundy colored hair and eyeglasses to match. I have a pale complexion, and I enjoy white privilege in most aspects of my life. I use she, her pronouns, and as a person of Eastern European, Ashkenazi Jewish descent, I'm keenly aware that my family's ability to escape from interwar Poland and ultimately to thrive in this country was dependent on a foundation that was built on stolen land with stolen labor. I'm not Indigenous to North America, don't have membership or cultural attachment to any tribe, not authorized to speak on behalf of any Indigenous person or tribal nation. And I'm never going to know what it's like to live as an Indigenous person in this country. I actually don't know if we have any members of Adat Shalom who are Indigenous. If we do, I don't think we've met, and I certainly, of course, don't speak for you. And although you're not under any obligation to announce yourself to me, I do want to let you know that I would be especially open to hearing what you think about this presentation and anything I got right or wrong, if you feel comfortable speaking up either today or reaching out afterwards. So here are a few images from my personal collection, all of which I and others had permission to take and to share, to illustrate that I take seriously the importance of working in collaborative partnership with Indigenous people. I make it a rule to team up with Native colleagues whenever I'm speaking or writing on issues that pertain to tribal communities. And I'm making a one-time exception to that rule for today's presentation. I'm sort of thinking of it as an invitation to help us start doing some of the inward-facing capacity building work that we need to do in order to be able to engage effectively with potential Indigenous partners. So another fact about myself, I grew up laughing at the comedy of Mel Brooks, including his 1974 classic, Blazing Saddles. I know some of you are going to be familiar with this, but just to refresh, in this scene, the Black sheriff, who's played by the actor Cleavon Little, is telling Gene Wilder's character how he came to be sheriff in this old Western town. He came as a young boy with his parents on a wagon train that was intercepted by the entire Sioux Nation. And when the tribal chief, who's played by Mel Brooks, sees the occupants of the wagon, he lets them go in Yiddish, Auf Wiedersehen, declaring, "They're darker than us. Have you ever seen such a thing in your lifetime?" And as Jews, we're kind of in on the joke, right? This scene reflects a broader theme that comes up a lot in Jewish art and culture, the idea that there's a special relationship or bond between Jews and Native Americans, and in this case, also Black people, because of our shared status as outsiders. And so I guess this idea was kind of imprinted in my mind from a fairly young age. But there's a lot of things that we've done and still do in popular culture that are harmful and offensive to Indigenous peoples, including, and I'm just going to say it, wearing a headdress and impersonating a chief and using racist mascots for sports teams. So let me throw out an aspirational goal for our work together. As Gregory Younging says in his book, Elements of Indigenous Style, when we're writing or speaking about Indigenous issues, and especially for anything that's tied to historical trauma, the guiding principle should be do no more harm, a kind of modified Hippocratic oath maybe for the work that we're doing. And this is going to require us to think beyond our own cultural lenses and remember that many of the things we say in our own language and culture might not be appropriate for others. And this is also maybe going to make us uncomfortable when we learn about the ways in which we might have unintentionally harmed Indigenous people through our word choices. One of my colleagues refers to this as getting comfortable with getting uncomfortable. So in my work, I tend to refer collectively to American Indian and Alaskan Native people and tribes, or AIAN as the abbreviation. And this is because I work in the federal government, and these are the terms used to describe the 574 federally recognized tribes in the lower 48 states and in Alaska. I'll just note there are no federally recognized tribes in Hawaii. The term Indigenous, which I sometimes use interchangeably with Native, is probably the most inclusive term. It refers in general to the original people who resided in a place. It's a term that isn't relative to current political or geographic delineations. And whenever I describe an Indigenous person, I try to use their preferred tribal affiliation. And if I don't know what that is, I'll ask. And also keep in mind, many tribes have multiple names, some of which they did not choose for themselves and may not prefer. And you can see here, there's a surprising number of words and phrases that we probably should just eliminate entirely from our vocabulary because they're offensive, painful, or sacred in ways that aren't ours to claim. All right, I'm going to just provide a little more historical context to ground our discussion. So the United States has always recognized that tribal nations are sovereign. They've recognized them as sovereign nations since the formation of the Union. And treaties established the working relationship between tribal nations and the US government. So I list Executive Order 13175 here as a more recent example of this. It was issued during the Clinton administration to clarify the obligations of federal agencies in coordinating and consulting with tribes. So sovereignty generally refers to the authority to self-govern. So the essence of tribal sovereignty is the ability to govern and to protect and to enhance the well-being of a tribe's citizens within its jurisdiction. And this gives tribes a unique government-to-government relationship with the US federal government. And this is important in that it defines a legal and a political relationship that goes beyond the usual racial and ethnic categorizations that we tend to use in things like the census and elsewhere. And it's in the context of that unique relationship that large tracts of land have been transferred, to use a probably too neutral term, under treaties that stipulate the provision of services and benefits for American and Indian Alaska Native citizens, such as the delivery of healthcare under the Indian Health Service. But the US has a pretty abysmal track record, to use the more appropriate and stronger term, of honoring. They have a bad track record of honoring and providing adequate funding to support these obligations. And I'll just note, in addition to the 574 currently federally recognized tribes, there are also state-recognized tribes located throughout the United States. And this is going to be important to keep in mind for us in Maryland, where we are home to no federally recognized tribes, but 3 that have been recognized by the state as of 2012. So more about that a bit later in our discussion. Let's see, next slide. This is just at a quick glance, this map depicts the distribution of federally recognized tribes across the United States by Indian Health Service areas. So there's 12 IHS areas across the United States, and in a place like Alaska, there's a whole lot of tribal nations, over 200, whereas you can see kind of on the eastern third of the United States, there's only 37 tribes in total. I should also point out I'll point this out in a second on the next slide. So this slide really makes the history of dispossession of land and of forced relocation much less of an abstract concept. What you see here in purple in the upper left-hand corner of the slide represents the lands that all tribal nations inhabited before contact in 1492. And then throughout the period of colonization, Indigenous people have been forced to relocate to land that white settlers didn't wish to occupy. And so the image on the lower right is pretty close to representing what native lands still look like today. The land that you see in purple is often referred to as reservations. This is where I wanted to note there's also tribal nations, in addition to those shown, that don't have land, non-land-based federally recognized tribes. And this isn't all ancient history. This has happened in the last 6 decades or so, especially. Tribal citizens have increasingly left reservations and relocated to urban centers. So according to US Census data, of the 5.2 million people who reported being American Indian or Alaska Native, this was in 2010, 71%, so a fairly significant majority, live in urban areas rather than on tribal lands and reservations, which is a substantial increase from 8% living in urban areas in 1940. And this rapid urbanization was catalyzed during a period of time known as the termination era in the mid-1900s through a series of deliberate assimilation-focused federal policies that had the effect of fragmenting tribal communities and undermining the support systems that were in place for tribes on their lands. So tribes were prompted to disband and to sell their land, and people had much less access to basic resources like food, employment, healthcare, education. And so they were incentivized to relocate to cities, sometimes a very far distance away from their homelands where they can seek employment. And I underscore all of this to point out that it's our country's policies that have rendered Indigenous people as nearly invisible here. And it makes it easy for us to forget that the Indigenous inhabitants of this land are actually still here. There's sort of this language of the vanishing Indian, and it really is a myth that should be vanquished. And all of this history has had a very important role in shaping enduring inequities in wealth, health, disease, and life expectancy for tribal citizens. All right. So now on to the body of the presentation. Why now? I think this is a very important and opportune moment in our history to be discussing reparations, including for Indigenous people in this country. And I'm going to draw on some examples that I'm personally more familiar with to make the case that there's reason for optimism. And I actually think we have a window of opportunity to make some real enduring structural changes. And I also believe that we have no other choice, that it's essential that this country and us as citizens of this country who enjoy the benefits of the democratic system, the capitalistic system, I should say, in which we live, to take long overdue action. And this requires a full accounting of our history that includes the experience of Indigenous populations, and that anything less will fall short of disrupting and repairing the consequences of repeated cycles of inequity. So I hope you've had a chance to read Ta-Nehisi Coates' treatise, his masterful treatise on reparations that he published in The Atlantic, he says that this commitment requires of us, quote, full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences. So where on earth do I pull optimism out of in this day and age? Well, we do have unprecedented Native representation in federal leadership positions right now in both the cabinet and in Congress. The court system, including the Supreme Court, is actively engaging with the status of tribal sovereignty and recognizing tribal jurisdiction. And I know it's not all good news there, but in general, over the past decade or so, and in a more concentrated way in just the past few years, I would say we've seen progress towards achieving more federal government accountability for what it owes, for what the federal government owes US tribal nations. So very early on in his administration, President Biden issued a memorandum that affirmed Clinton's Executive Order 13175, in which he charged his federal government agencies with engaging in regular, meaningful, and robust consultation with tribal officials in the development of federal policies that have tribal implications. Last year, the NIH was among the federal agencies that issued a new tribal consultation policy. And consultation is a formal process of exchanging information between federal and tribal leaders. And at NIH, it's seen as an important opportunity for the scientific community to learn from tribal leaders and to respectfully take into account all of the knowledge and priorities and concerns and culture of tribal nations before we develop NIH research policies and priorities and programs that interact with tribal communities. The current administration has gone a step further in formally recognizing Indigenous knowledge as a valid body of scientific knowledge that has important contributions to make to scientific advancements and in informing federal policy. You may have also heard it referred to as tribal ecological knowledge, or TEK. In general, Indigenous knowledge refers to a holistic body of observations, oral and written knowledge, innovations, practices, beliefs that have been developed by Indigenous peoples through their interactions with the environment since, they'll say, since time immemorial. And it has particular relevance to climate and environmental policy. And this guidance is pretty unprecedented in the history of this country at the level of federal government policymaking. So I do think there is a lot to feel optimistic about, maybe even excited. On the other hand, COVID-19 laid bare all of the structural factors, historical, political, economic, social, everything that's shaped our highly inequitable world. And I wish it didn't take a pandemic to bring urgency to the work of addressing health disparities that disproportionately burden Indigenous peoples in this country. But the past few years have really reminded us of our collective failures to understand and address the social determinants of health and the persistent impacts of racism and trauma. The data that we do have indicate that American Indian and Alaska Native people between the ages of 25 and 64 are approximately between 4 and 19 times as likely to die of COVID-19 relative to non-Hispanic white people. But there's a reason for us to be concerned over the accuracy of these data because of underreporting, which means that these figures are likely, these disparities are even larger than reported most likely. So in the second paper that I had listed on this slide, it issues a series of report cards for states in terms of how they're doing with reporting data for its tribal populations, including the state of Maryland doing quite poorly. And the authors write, I'm just going to read this in its entirety because it's really one of the most devastating statements I've come across regarding the impacts of the pandemic. However, this, meaning these negative, these bad report cards, this does not begin to capture the long-term consequences for American Indian and Alaska Native persons deriving from the loss of so many elders. Gone are key leaders including the keepers of unwritten language, and enduring are disruptions of tribes, nations, bands, pueblos, communities, native villages, and families who face complicated waves of grieving. For AIAN populations who are especially sensitive to threats of genocide, COVID-19 reawakens awareness of structural racism as a weapon for their destruction. American Indian and Alaska Native people are often rendered invisible in data for a variety of reasons. They get othered and aggregated together with small groups, sometimes or even just described as white, or they're simply not recorded or reported in a way that allows for stratification and analysis. But we also know that Indigenous people are often reluctant to enroll in federally funded research, and for pretty darn good reasons that are grounded in our historical track record of being untrustworthy in pretty much all of our interactions with tribal nations. And so there's this real tension between the goals of increasing the amount of good data that are generated for minoritized communities who bear a disproportionate burden of disease, with the reasons why these very same populations are reluctant to enroll in research. And we can't just double down and say the answer is more research unless we address the factors that have been causing this tension, which have a lot to do with historical racism. So how do we break out of this cycle? In order to get to one possible answer to that question, I need to back up a bit, or I'm going to try to back up a bit to the origins of our contemporary research ethics codes and regulations, which were largely developed in response to what I expect will be at least somewhat familiar. They're highly publicized cases of unethical research and human rights abuses involving marginalized populations. So I'm going to talk briefly just about a few paradigmatic examples that help shape the regulatory landscape. So my entire career was influenced by a pretty unique experience I had in graduate school when I took a year off to work as a junior researcher with President Clinton's Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, which he charged with declassifying thousands of documents and telling the truth about our country's history of performing ionizing radiation experiments on its own citizens throughout the Cold War, and also for assessing whether our current day research policies and practices are adequate to ensure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. So this photograph here, which unfortunately I guess was taken before selfies were invented, but at least it shows how close I was sitting to the stage at the ceremony where we presented the final report to President Clinton and the members of his cabinet. And so this report and its several thick appendices were very comprehensive in their documentation of research that had been conducted, including observational studies of uranium miners, many of whom were Navajo, as well as radioactive iodine injections in Alaska Native people. And although my own role was mostly focused on the present day context of research, the most striking thing about that day for me was hearing President Clinton apologize and take responsibility on behalf of the federal government, the mistakes it had made and the harms it had caused to its own citizens. And he did this in the language of moral responsibility and a duty of the government. And this provided a blueprint for the apology he would offer a few years later to the Black men who were the victims of the US Public Health Service study of untreated syphilis that's commonly referred to as the Tuskegee study. And so this is the model I came to believe in early in my career, this idea of holding the federal government accountable for what it owes the people that it serves. And so this is something that I've carried with me, certainly through my work at the NIH. And I know that we know how to do this in the federal government, right? So let's see, this photo was taken in 2019, and this time I actually managed to get into the photo when I had an opportunity to visit the Bioethics Center at Tuskegee University, which was created as one of the responses to Clinton's apology. So this was an important step in bringing Black voices forward in the field of bioethics, in beginning to mend the trust relationship between government-funded researchers and the Black community. And I don't think I'll ever forget hearing from the descendants, from the grandchildren of the men who were the victims of this research. A very vivid and very tangible way to understand the enduring impacts of the intergenerational trauma that still continues to haunt those families, as well as the broader community. But that's not actually where the story ends. And unfortunately, I actually think that some of the responses to this study were short-sighted. So, one sec. Just a quick review of the timeline for the US Public Health Service study. And I want to clarify, I want to make clear that I'm making a conscious choice to name those who are responsible for conducting unethical research rather than to continue stigmatizing the places and the people who are harmed by the research. And this is something that my colleagues of color have repeatedly pointed out to me in the spirit of doing no more harm. So I refer to this as the US Public Health Service study. It was conducted with poor Black male sharecroppers in Macon County, Alabama. And it was a deeply problematic study that was racist in its design to begin with, that worked hard to deprive the men of effective treatment even once penicillin became widely available, and failed to disclose basic information to the men about the nature of the interventions in the study, and even that they had syphilis in the first place. And the study lasted for a total of 40 years, which I'll note is more than 20 years after the Nuremberg Code of Research Ethics was issued, and even after a CDC Blue Ribbon panel reviewed the study and recommended its continuation. The thing that eventually shut it down was this article by AP reporter Jean Heller being published in 1972, which was just over 50 years ago. So in 1972, when the story broke, the study was stopped, congressional hearings were held, and this led to the passage of the 1974 National Research Act. This included the creation of another national commission, this time for the protection of human subjects of biomedical and behavioral research. Actually, this commission was one of the first major bioethics commissions that predated the other one I mentioned by quite a few years. It was a very commission that was in place for a number of years, including producing this one report called the Belmont Report, which I think was just named after the place where the meeting was held. This is what provided the framework for our modern research regulations, which were first established in 1981, that set up, that established the requirements for the ethics review committees known as IRBs that oversee research, like the one I still chair today at the NIH. And the regulations and the process of ethical review that they established is shaped by these three principles that were articulated in the Belmont Report to safeguard the rights and welfare of individual research participants. And these are pretty good principles that address some of the major problems associated with the Public Health Service study, like the lack of informed consent and the unacceptable risk-benefit ratio of withholding effective treatments like penicillin in order to meet the aims of research. But I join a number of people who have argued that the very narrow conception of justice that was described and ultimately codified in the regulations fails to introduce community-level protections that were all. So you might say that these Belmont principles are necessary but not sufficient, which is kind of unfortunate given that it has historically so often been minoritized, racialized, and sometimes geographically isolated communities who have been exploited and harmed by research. And maybe you've heard this term helicopter research. It's a whole category of unethical research, which might even adhere to the Belmont principles, but it's nonetheless unethical. It describes research where a researcher comes into a community, collects samples and data, and then they're never heard from again. They never return to the communities to ensure that the work provides benefit to them. And this is a pattern experienced time and time again by many Indigenous communities around the world. There's one case in particular that we have a lot of detail about because of a lawsuit that was filed. And so, again, just a quick review of the timeline for this study, which I'll refer to as the Arizona State University or ASU case, rather than the Havasupai case for the same reasons I gave earlier. So ASU researchers collected samples from members of this tribe to try to better understand the extraordinarily high rates of type 2 diabetes in this community. And this was initially done with the willing participation of the tribe, just because of how important this health issue was. And a genetic risk factor for type 2 diabetes was never found through this research, which is sometimes how research goes. But years later, the tribe learned that the researchers had continued to use those same samples for research that they hadn't consented to on topics that were very stigmatizing and harmful to them. And so they sued the researcher and the university system, and this resulted in a settlement with provision of some payment, resources for infrastructure, and importantly, the return of the samples to the tribe so that they could be handled in a respectful manner and to signify the end of the research. And this study and so many like it have had a tremendously negative impact on the trust relationship between tribes and researchers. But I think the lessons from this have been slow to catch on. This isn't merely a case of a few bad apples in the research community, as is often said. I was just on a webinar yesterday where someone stated that the ASU case was the result of one investigator behaving badly. And, of course, that might be partly to blame, but it's just too much of a pattern of behavior at this point to leave it at that. So to paraphrase what Sarah Goring and her colleagues have written about the concept of responsive justice, these cases of helicopter research show us that there's a profound disconnect by our common academic research practices, like adhering to very narrowly constructed federal regulations, and legitimate tribal community expectations. And it's responsive justice that requires us to bridge this gap. And doing this requires us to address the history of trauma and stigma and exclusion and failure to respect the sovereignty of tribes. And really the onus is on us to change our practices to become more trustworthy, which begins with understanding how to respect tribal sovereignty and how to give tribes more control over the conduct of research in their communities. And so that's what my colleagues and I have really been focusing on these past few years, bolstered by an important regulatory development in 2017, when the research regulations, which are sometimes referred to as the Common Rule, were updated to explicitly include multiple references to the role of tribal law in the ethical oversight of research, so that if our regulations form a minimum standard, tribes can now add additional protections to enhance the ethical conduct of research in their own communities. And I'm very grateful for all I've learned from the trainees I've had a privilege to work with over the years, including Dr. Dina Aroundhim, who's a citizen of Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and spent time with us at the NIH as a research ethics intern. And as she's quoted here, when discussions of research ethics are inclusive of tribal perspectives, the likelihood of conducting research in a way that's meaningful and ethical and appropriate increases. Okay. What emerges from more inclusive discussions are more robust ethical frameworks, such as this one that I cite frequently, that was developed by a group of Indigenous bioethicists and geneticists led by Dr. Katrina Klaw. And you can just see at quick glance how much more robust, how much more holistic this is than the Belmont principles. And although those are implicit in the framework, you can see it centers tribal sovereignty and the community. It adds a focus on relationships with the community and expectations for reciprocity and dissemination. And there's a lot more focus now on empowering tribal communities to be more directly involved in the conduct of research as scientists, with movements like Indigenous data sovereignty and funding mechanisms to help build research capacity within tribal communities. And then just about a month ago, as a beautiful bookend to this section of my presentation, one of the important professional organizations that represents the field of genetics in this country, the American Society for Human Genetics, or ASHG, issued a profoundly, I think, important acknowledgement and apology for the society's role in contributing to scientific racism in eugenics. So this accounting included the harms caused by reifying false beliefs in a genetic basis of race, and the genetic inferiority of non-white, non-European people, and the uptake of these ideas and eugenic policies and Nazi ideology. And it included mention of the both long and surprisingly recent history of involuntary sterilization of Native women, among others. And it's relevant, it's really important how diverse the roster of experts who were consulted for this report are, including the lead author of that ethical framework I just shared on my previous slide, Dr. Katrina Klaw. So I'm sharing all of this as a case study that illustrates how engaging with and learning from the experiences of Indigenous peoples as part of our collective biography, in this one case at least, has brought us much closer to achieving racial equity in the context of biomedical research than we were able to achieve without doing so over the past century. So I'm going to pause here to allow some time for a little discussion and questions. I didn't see anything popping up in the chat. I'm not sure if anybody wrote anything in there, but go ahead and jump in if anybody has a couple of clarifying questions or things you want to note. Let's see, I see hands going up. Peter, do you want to lead us off?
Sure. First of all, thank you for a wonderful introduction. I should say that my name's Peter Dratch, and I've recently retired from a 30-year career with the Department of the Interior, which is hardly blameless with regard to the treatment of Native people, including in the Department Bureau of Indian Affairs. I wanted to talk about something specifically, maybe you'll get to it at the end. I work with some Indigenous people with regard to this new understanding that we're going to actually use traditional ecological knowledge or the knowledge of Native people with regard to bison. I work in Colorado, which is the land of the Arapaho and the Cheyenne, people who lived with and lived by bison for millennia. And I wanted to, since you've raised the issue of genetics, I want to talk about something that's pretty important to the Native people that I talk to, which is blood quantum, which you probably want to explain. But really, it's the means by which Native people have essentially been removed from the ranks of tribes because they don't have a high enough percentage. And as particularly as Jewish people, we have to be sensitive to how you can intermarry and still have the culture of a people. So maybe if you would go into at some point a little bit about the insidious nature of blood quantum and how that has served to erase really the humanness and the affiliation of Native peoples. I think it's pretty important when we start talking about reparations, because it's whether you're counted or not.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I mean, that's such a critically important point. And I wasn't going to go into it in my prepared comments any more deeply, but I can react to it briefly, and I'm happy to follow up. This is an area that I've spent really some time thinking about in my work life, especially being a part of the Genome Institute. Whenever I meet with or speak with a Native community, there's always concern expressed about the unintended consequences of genetic research and its how it feeds into genetic ancestry testing. And we did a whole research project on how commercial ancestry testing services sort of market and talk about Indigenous identity and how, and as if a genetic test can generate that identity and can provide evidence of that, which is highly problematic. So, I mean, I think in your comments, you've made the very important point that tribes have been put in a, that genetics threatens the ability of tribes as sovereign nations to make the decisions about who they count as members of their tribe and how they define kinship. And I know currently of no tribes that rely on genetic information, except sometimes to clarify parentage, paternity testing kinds of genetics. But blood quantum in genetics has often been used against the ability to establish membership. And that's a highly problematic area. I'm happy to follow up offline, share that paper and so on. But thank you for raising that important point. Why don't we take one more question, Polly, from you, and then we can continue on.
Thank you, Sarah. This is so interesting, and it just makes me feel so incredibly ignorant and embarrassed of that. But when you talk about initially the demographics, 574 tribal nations, it sounds so impressive. And then you show us that map and that tiny little dots of green that probably many of us have driven through. So where are all these people? You said 71% are urbanized. So, but that's still 30% are in those green dots. And so when you're living with your tribal nation, you're in a sovereign state and you have more rights than when you're relocated to the urban centers. Obviously isolated from your community is horrific, but I'm wondering also, what do people give up in terms of rights also when they leave those sovereign states?
I think that is a very complicated area that you're touching on. I can say a little bit about it in the research context, but for tribes that establish research regulations, the Navajo Nation is one of the largest tribes, and they have their own institutional review board that reviews the ethics of research that takes place on their lands. And although they are willing to think about the ethics of research that involves its citizens at locations outside of their tribal lands, really the jurisdiction of a tribe is typically defined as being within the geographic or some more narrowly defined jurisdiction, and it's not clear that their jurisdiction would extend beyond those boundaries. And so that's an important limitation. You're touching on something very important that we're still grappling with, that these wonderful new protections really only pertain to research that take place within tribal communities. And so that still leaves very important questions for the ethics of research with urban communities. And that's just the world that I live in. These issues of jurisdiction and the reach and which rules take precedence when there's a conflict between state and federal and tribal laws is a whole area of law in itself that I have to admit that I don't have enough familiarity to say anything about outside of the research context. Yes, Luther, you're asking a question about an American Indian or Alaska Native citizen still retains their membership, or very often still, if they choose to, will retain their membership in the tribe. So my colleagues who work at the NIH, who are Navajo, who are Diné, are still Navajo and still members, but the research regulations that their tribe uses to protect things that take place in the tribal college on their lands don't apply when they enroll in studies at the NIH necessarily. Okay, shall we continue with the next section? Why us? Let me get back to sharing my screen. Oh no, did I do something foolish? All right. Give me 1 second here. I thought oh, where did you all go? So let's see, that's the last slide, right? You can see that now?
Yes.
All right, great. So why us? I take it that we're generally in agreement on the relevance of understanding reparations within a Jewish framework and lens, drawing on Jewish teachings on accountability, repentance and relational repair, or teshuvah. I'm still working out the different ways I've heard it pronounced. But in any case, just as the Reconstructing Judaism resolution lays it out. But I'm going to explore some more specific ways in which I, as a Jewish person, and Jews more generally, interact with Indigenous peoples in this country, and the ways that we've done so in the past. So I happen to be a Jewish bioethicist, as in a bioethicist who's Jewish, not one who specializes in Jewish ethics. And I've kept my personal and my professional identities mostly separate throughout my career. But I joined Adat Shalom last year in part because I started to think about career Sarah and Jewish Sarah as being more intertwined. And as I became more deeply engaged with the work with tribal communities, being aware of my own identity and its relationship to the work has become more and more important to me. I was being invited into community, a reciprocal process of sharing story, as it's often said. And it wasn't just enough for me to sit there passively listening and learning. It was important to participate in the relationship, to share and reflect together on our connections, commonalities, and differences, and how we regard the importance of family and ancestral connections, humor and food, which are the really fun parts, and even the comparative experience of genocide and historical trauma, the not so fun parts. And it was sometime in this lengthy and ongoing process of self-reflection on my own identity and its positionality to the work that I learned about Reconstructionist Judaism, and more than a very superficial understanding of Tikkun Olam, which I now see as having potential to provide a real coherence and motivation and even solidarity with others in the work. The truth is, I also had a pretty superficial understanding of the historical connections between Jewish and Indigenous people in this country and how far back they go. We've generally been relying on a very Jewish-centric telling of that history. And this gets to the heart of the distinctive aspects of our call for reparations as American Jews. So this image is just a photo I took on my iPhone of a photograph that's published in this really lovely two-volume collection that I own of the photography of Frederick Brenner, in which he has documented Jewish people living all around the world in diaspora, as well as an entire volume of associated commentaries on those photos. So this photo is of some kind of spiritual gathering of Navajo citizens and Jewish people in Monument Valley, Arizona in 1994. And the commentaries that are included are all by Jewish men, including one of the rabbis who appears in the left side of the photo there, who asserts that there was this sort of lovely, profound weave of connection between Native Americans and the Jewish people and how they, quote, saw each other in the mirror of time. And I mean, I just love the technical aspects of this photo, how the horizon is lined up, and it's pretty impressive that both groups are in focus. But in a totally separate book that I highly recommend, it's called Members of the Tribe, Native America in the Jewish Imagination. The author, Rachel Rubenstein, offers a very different perspective on this photo and the associated commentaries that I think is so important for us to keep in mind in the relation to our own work. So she states, quote, just as the Navajos are only glimpsed as reflections in the photograph, their voices are also absent in the recollection of the event, as other Jewish voices debate Jewish native likeness or unlikeness and the gathering's utility or inutility. In a similar fashion, I am painfully aware of how, yet again, with very few exceptions, Indigenous Americans have served throughout these discussions as represented objects rather than speaking as subjects. And this just maps onto my comments earlier about the importance of centering Indigenous voices with humility to make sure we're not taking up too much space in these discussions. And I guess it's a gentle reminder to us and to myself, we are the ones taking up all the space today with this conversation. So this is an image of the manifest from the ship on which my grandfather, Morris Jabitsky of blessed memory, and his family arrived at Ellis Island almost exactly 100 years ago. And on the right is the page of testimony that we just tracked down a few weeks ago that tells us the fate that a cousin he left behind in Warsaw ultimately suffered in 1942 in the Shoah. And also a ticket from the time I visited the DC Holocaust Memorial Museum with my grandfather when he was still alive. And I've tended to think of the origins of the Jewish American experience as being in alignment with my own family's history in this period of intense immigration in the early 1900s and in the subsequent responses to the Shoah. And I think this is true for so many American Jews of Eastern European descent. including the parts of that experience that interact with Indigenous peoples in North America. So on the left here is a snapshot of an old book that I was able to get my hands on from 1959. It's entitled something like Indianische Jurtselungen, or Indian Tales is the translation, by Shmuel Deixel. It's written in Yiddish, which I can't read very well, but I really only wanted it for the pictures anyway. So you can see on the cover design kind of fancifully adds the title and the author's name in Yiddish to a sort of a native Pacific Northwestern style decoration. And my best guess is that this was not created by an Indigenous artist, nor with permission to use a traditional Indigenous design. Rachel Rubenstein writes about this in her book that I mentioned earlier. She describes this cover as a model of the tropes that the author uses throughout the text to construct and assert kinship with Jewish and Indigenous people through the lens of his radical left-wing politics, in which he sees brotherhood as transcending race and ethnicity, offers critiques against genocide and the imperialist policies of the US federal government against American Indians, as well as seeing those policies as linked with the fate of Jews in Europe. And this is just one example of the many ways in which Jewish people, as artists, writers, activists, anthropologists, you can see Franz Boas here in the photo on the right, linguists and other professions have imagined and constructed an identification with Indigenous populations in this country. I've mentioned now this book on the left a few times, and you can see the cover of it includes that Brenner photo. In addition, I want to recommend David Kaufman's book, The Jews Indian: Colonialism, Pluralism, and Belonging in America, or at least listening to the two-part recording with him of a discussion that was hosted by the Weitzman Museum in Philadelphia a few months ago in honor of National Native American Heritage Month. David Kaufman is a historian, and he explains that the title of his book, The Jews Indian, is a play on the title of another book you may have heard of from the 1970s called The White Man's Indian: Images of the American Indian from Columbus to the Present. And he does this on purpose because it forces the reader to think about the subject and the object. Both books are not about Native Americans. They are looking at white and Jewish people's representations of Native Americans. And I think more comprehensively than anything else I've come across, David Kaufman's book grounds the case for a Jewish obligation to work towards reconciliation in an understanding that not only have we derived the fundamental benefits in living in this country on its history of dispossession, but also because we even participated in colonialism. It's not just a problem that we inherited. There were Jews who were actually part of the westward expansion, sometimes peacefully and sometimes not so much, where Jews were able to accumulate land and wealth, establish businesses, and enjoy many of the privileges of whiteness with relative freedom from government interference for many decades, at least during the 1800s. And it's just really striking to see photos of Jewish entrepreneurs on the American Western frontier engaged in all sorts of economic encounters with Native people. Kaufman provides detailed evidence that frontier Jews, for the most part, embraced colonial settlement and its associated racism. Although at least we can say with some confidence that the focus was not on religious conversion, as it so often was with early Christian settlers. But Jewish and Native American experiences started to align in the earlier part of the 20th century when both anti-Semitism and anti-Indian sentiments became more prevalent, and we start to see eugenic policies and other manifestations of white Christian supremacy taking hold. So we know, for example, that in 1924, which was just 2 years after my own grandfather arrived here from Poland, the Immigration Act severely restricted access to the US for Eastern European Jews, among other groups, while the Indian Citizenship Act was passed in that same year, which, although on its face that might sound like it was a good thing, it's actually widely viewed as an act to further assimilate American Indians and strip them of independence and sovereignty. So in this time period, many Jews became aligned with a much more progressive mindset focused on uplifting Indigenous rights and civil rights more broadly, linking their own fate to those of all minoritized groups. So we know many Jewish leaders participated in advancing Native American rights and self-governance, both within the federal government and in advocacy work. The story of Felix S. Cohen is one that gets a lot of attention in Kaufman's book. Cohen was a lawyer, starting with the FDR administration, who would go on to become the primary legal architect of the so-called Indian New Deal. And he's basically credited with creating the modern field of federal Indian law. And he gave a graduation speech at CCNY in 1953. And in it, he shared his vision of America's highest ideals as being attributable to the twin influences of Judaism and Native American culture, care for the stranger on the one hand, and the spirit of tolerance on the other hand. And there's something really appealing and I think lesson worthy in this idea as a kind of corrective to the whole Christian doctrine of discovery. But I think it's also important for us to remember that this was a Jewish man's musings over the role of Indigenous knowledge in the meaning of Americanism. And I think a valid critique that some have made regarding the accomplishments of this whole time period is that they were very much achieved using the tools and existing frameworks of the federal government, and with an assumption that assimilation was as much of a goal for Native Americans as it was for so many Jewish Americans, when in reality, this mostly wasn't at all the case. And so it'd be really arrogant of me to think about how I measure up to Felix Cohen in my own career of federal service. And I mean, it's no contest when I think about how much he accomplished, but I do think it's fair to say that we're doing a little bit better in one respect, which is, I think the conversation now is getting to a point of being more respectful of tribal sovereignty than it was in Felix Cohen's day. And we're developing formal processes for listening and deferring to tribal leaders and their own governance structures and ways of knowing, rather than to continue imposing our own structures and knowledge on them while appropriating theirs to use for ourselves. Okay, just one last point for this section of my presentation on why us. One important thing that I think we can all do is to make space to listen to the lived experiences of Jews of color, including those who embody both Jewish and Native identities. Those who can authentically lay claim to both of those identities and who live with the intersectional complexity that the overlap entails. So this is my fangirl slide dedicated to Sarah Podemsky. And I'm so grateful that people like Sarah are so open, in her case, about being an Anishinaabe Ashkenazi woman who maintains a strong familial and cultural connection to both her Jewish and Native identities. She's actually right now serving as the guest co-host of the podcast Chutzpah, if any of you follow that over the next few weeks. And she's also the actress who plays Bear's mother on the amazing FX television series Reservation Dogs, which is entirely written and directed by Indigenous creators. It's really the first show of its kind. So if you only take one thing away from my presentation today, it is that you should be watching this show. But it was very compelling to hear Sarah's talk at the Weitzman Museum back in November, and I think there's a recording of this available as well, about the comparative experiences within her own family and community of reparations from Germany that helped her grandfather get back on his feet after the Holocaust on the one hand, and the ongoing anguish and trauma associated with the whole truth and reconciliation process in Canada around the treatment of Indigenous children at residential schools on the other hand. And so hers is a voice worth paying attention to. And obviously I'm a big fan. And if you've ever noticed the dream catcher in the background in my home office here, it turns out that Sarah Podemsky is also an artist, and I purchased that directly from her. And also just a quick shout out to the wonderful Taika Waititi, who's another amazing Indigenous and Jewish creator, in his case, Maori, to keep your eyes out for. And he also works with Sarah on the show Reservation Dogs. And then just as a fun closing note for this section of my presentation, I was extremely happy when I heard that Mel Brooks would be releasing History of the World Part 2 next month on Hulu. And would you believe that none other than Taika Waititi is one of the actors involved? So that is definitely something we can all look forward to. So let's pause here again. And I'd really be interested to know if any of this was new or surprising to you, and maybe how this maps onto your own conceptions of your personal story as an American Jew, and how that intersects with the people who are indigenous to this country. So let's see, there you all are. Okay. So yes, I will, Luther, you asked in the chat if I will make a list of the references. I will, and I also have a series of web links as well with additional resources for folks who want to dig deeper. So does anybody have any thoughts or questions at this point? Anita, I see your hand up.
Yes, so you had mentioned that Maryland did very poorly with its indigenous people. And I was wondering if you could speak a little more to whether there's an actual reservation in Maryland. Is there a specific area that they're living in? Just if you could just speak more generally to that point.
Yeah, sure. And I'm actually going to cover this in some more detail in the next section as well. So there are no, I think it's correct that there are no tribes that own land in Maryland. There are some land trusts and some funds that are getting started up, and there may be some Piscataway controlled buildings and lands. But I think when we're looking at what the counts would be for the state of Maryland and its report card, it's likely pertaining to American Indian and Alaska Native citizens of federally recognized tribes living here in the state of Maryland off of their own tribal lands, is what I assume. I'd have to go back and look at the methodology again of that one paper that generated that report card. But in general, the Indian Health Service is providing services to members of federally recognized tribes and not state or unrecognized indigenous peoples in various locations. And thank you, Polly, for answering that question. Chutzpah. Any other questions at this point? There's one last section to get through, and then we'll open it up. The next section is a quick one. It's just to throw out some very concrete ideas for us to chew on. Should I go ahead and continue? And then that should leave us with at least 10 minutes at the end. All right, hopefully this screen share will be the smoothest of all. What next? So I do just want to acknowledge briefly, I know the RJ resolution explicitly voiced support for the passage of HR 40, which called for establishing a commission to study and consider a national apology and reparations for the institution of slavery. And I'm aware that the bill doesn't include reparations for Indigenous peoples. I'm also, a little bit concerned that the current composition of the House probably doesn't favor this bill being brought to the floor for consideration this term. Maybe an alternative approach, such as an executive order, would be a way to bring about the creation of such a commission, at least as a short-term solution. But I don't interpret that what we're really here to do today as calling for any changes to HR 40 or really any advocacy on its behalf. And that's probably where I'd have to draw a line anyway, in terms of what I'm permitted to do as an employee of the executive branch. I'm also not discussing some larger scale initiatives like tuition waivers that have been granted by universities in the states of California and Arizona for students who are tribal citizens. As Jackie reminded us in her introductory comments, the resolution also calls for local study and action. And so really that's where I want to steer the remainder of our conversation today, in the hopes of getting us started in developing an action plan that our own community can embark upon. So The local tribe that I know the most about is called the Piscataway tribe. The Piscataway were one of the more prevalent people in the Chesapeake region at the time of European contact, and today are still here. The Piscataway still reside mostly in southern Maryland. And on January 9th, 2012, as you can see in this photo, Governor O'Malley recognized two tribes of Piscataway heritage, one that's called the Piscataway Conoy tribe, that also includes the Cedarville Band of Piscataways and the Piscataway Indian Nation. They are the first tribes that were recognized in the state of Maryland. And then in 2017, Governor Hogan also added the Accohannock Indian tribe to the list as the third state recognized tribe. And there's a commission, a Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs, that serves as the official statewide agency for tribes in our state. And it has a process that's somewhat analogous to the one that I described earlier for the federal government in terms of consultation between state agencies and tribes. Several Adat Shalomers, including a couple that are on in this discussion today, have asked me about doing research on the people who were the original inhabitants of the actual land that Adat Shalom is located on, and whether we should develop a land acknowledgement for our congregation. And there's some very nice information available on the Ritual Well website about how to understand land acknowledgements as a way of recognizing that we are guests on the ancestral homelands of Indigenous people. And the authors of this resource point out that as Jews, we have a complex relationship to land, indigeneity, and diaspora, and that our tradition compels us to acknowledge all Indigenous people who have lived and continue to live and exist in relationship to the lands where we as Jewish people continue to dwell and pray. And I don't disagree in principle with the idea of developing a land acknowledgement on behalf of Adat Shalom, as long as we're coupling that with developing authentic relationships with the Indigenous people who are still here, as well as informed action on their behalf. So I think maybe, land acknowledgements are an initial step, maybe in that necessary but not sufficient category. And I would point to what Eric Green, who is a Jewish person of African American, Native American, and Russian and Polish ancestry, what he said during the movement-wide Day of Learning last year. He reminds us that reparations are not just about money or discharging a debt. So specifically in terms of land acknowledgements, we might be tempted to view them as a sort of verbal discharge of the debt that we owe. But he raises concern that land acknowledgements can easily become performative acts that merely pay lip service and have no substance. And so, I think I agree with Eric that we need to guard against that. That said, here's an example of a very comprehensive land acknowledgement that was developed by the Racial Equity and Social Justice Advisory Committee in Montgomery County that we might look at as a starting point. So you can see it, in addition to naming all of the state recognized tribes, it includes many other people who either were or perhaps are still here. And it's also noteworthy that they even include tribal citizens who live in this state away from their own homelands, who we might refer to as urban Indians or as Indigenous people living in diaspora. Although I asked some of my Native colleagues, and none of them have ever referred to themselves as living in diaspora, even though that's a term I often use like in relation to Jewish people living in the United States who came here, say, from Eastern Europe or other places in the world. And there's even more to this land acknowledgement. I couldn't fit it all on the slide, but the last sentence reads that as members of this particular committee, we oppose oppression in all of its forms and seek to repair past injustices as we work to advance an equitable future for all. So this does seem substantive and very tied to their mission. So I'd be interested to know more about what process they undertook to develop this statement. And perhaps this is something that we can follow up with them directly about. I think it's also instructive for us to look at the example of the Maryland State Arts Council, which to its credit has been very forthcoming and humble about its experiences with trying to create a land acknowledgement they clarify on their web resource that they published that they've been unable to consult with several of the tribes whose lands are claimed by Maryland. And one of the tribes that they reached out to in particular, this was the Cedarville Band Wild Turkey Clan of the Piscataway Conoy. They both declined to consult with them and requested that they state in this resource guide that the band declined to engage in and does not endorse this land acknowledgement project. And instead, tribal leadership requested that people learn about paying land tax and giving land back, and what land acknowledgement on Piscataway Conoy lands look like to them in their own sovereign words. And they have some nice recorded statements by tribal leaders that are available on their website, which I didn't post here, but it's just piscatawayindians.com. So they, instead of publishing a land acknowledgement, they make some suggestions for starting points, as you can see listed here. And just regarding that last point, I would note that Adat Shalom is pretty heavily engaged in environmental advocacy and in stewarding the lands, that we own or control. So there are green tikkun and other activities, for example. So we may just want to give some intentional thought about the potential connections there between those activities and the idea of reparations. I recently learned about Jews on Ohlona, I think it's pronounced, land, which is involved in a number of initiatives in the Bay Area in California that I think could be a model for us to draw on. So their website describes a whole lot of activities that they're involved in, but I think the main initiative of this organization is to facilitate paying a land tax as a voluntary annual financial contribution that non-Indigenous people make to support the work of this Segoria Te land trust. And this is to do things like supporting their efforts to acquire and preserve land, establish a cemetery to be able to reinter stolen ancestral remains and build urban gardens, community centers, and sacred arbors so that current and future generations of Indigenous people can thrive in the Bay Area. And so I have some leads on possible activities in Maryland along these lines that we might be able to undertake. So, it's for my birthday last year. It happens to fall in the middle of Native American Heritage Month. I did my first ever Facebook fundraiser for the nonprofit organization called Through Piscataway Eyes, Inc., which includes a land trust, which is as a division of the organization. So in general, they work to promote and protect the welfare, culture, and history of members of the tribe. They provide scholarships and resources to members, and they accept land and monetary donations so that they can have land available for future generations of Piscataway people. And there may be other similar land trusts like this already established that I haven't yet come across in my research. And I also learned that two of our sister Unitarian Universalist congregations co-hosted a service last October. Unfortunately, I didn't hear about it till after it was over, but it was led by a member of the Piscataway Conoy tribe. And this was in honor of both the Prince George's County and the National Native American Heritage Month activities. So, we could organize fundraisers or make an annual commitment to pay a land tax to the tribes on whose land our building is located. Or I could reach out to counterparts at these UU congregations and maybe other local organizations to learn more about the steps that they've already undertaken to engage with local tribes. So as I wrap this up and we just finish our time in discussion, I'm really interested to know if there's anything that stands out from what I've presented that you're especially eager to learn more about or pursue. Do we want to invite David Kaufman to lead a discussion of his book with us? I invited him to actually come to the session tonight, but he wasn't available. But he said he might be willing, he would be willing to find a time, to participate on a panel or engage with us in some way if we wanted to follow up on that. Do we want to do fundraising to contribute to a land tax or a land trust fund? And I'd also be really interested to know if any of you know whether we have resources within the congregation. Do we have any local historians or with any of our Maryland state tribes that we might be able to build upon. So really looking forward to hearing your thoughts, and thank you very much for your time. All right, thank you. Luther, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, although I'm not a professional historian, it was my undergrad degree. And my family actually has been in this part of the world since shortly after the Piscataway were pushed out. And so I do know a little bit about the Native groups that were in Montgomery County that's very diverse. Because of the Potomac River, it was actually, there are a lot of Native trails because it was a transitional area. The Seneca, who ended up being part of the Iroquois Nation, were actually here. That's why we have Seneca. That's why we talk about Seneca sandstone. They actually came through this part of Maryland. So it's really complicated. I do think that River Road was one of the main indigenous trails that predated European settlement. Route 28 definitely was, and I believe Route 355, Frederick Road. So after the close of this program year, because I've sort of got a gig going right now, I'm happy to help with researching that, although I do tend to agree with what you said about the facility, it's not really enough just to acknowledge that we're on lands that were once used by people. We have to reach out and really have a meaningful interaction with them.
Thank you. Yeah, I would love to learn more about what you know about all of that history, and thank you for those comments. I'm noting a couple of things in the chat which will get saved and we can share. And yes, I'm happy to make, I'll turn these slides into a PDF and I'll be happy to make that available as well. Marilyn.
Sarah, I think this was just an incredible presentation. We can all thank you enough, but I think one of the things that you brought out is how the federal government itself can do some of these repairs, as I think that was part of your theme, if I'm not mistaken.
Well,
and
yeah, go ahead, continue.
And I think that other parts of the federal government, as we've heard of, for example, environmental protection have been doing, establishing separate
But Marilyn, I think you accidentally hit your mute while you were talking.
Okay.
I lost you in the middle. There you go.
I was just saying that EPA and other, HHS in general have done things that we could say are apologies or an attempt at reparations. So I just hope that people listening to this take that broad view and, like you said, don't get like hopeless about the fact of seeing any progress, because it does seem like the federal government probably has the best equipment for making these repairs, aside from us individuals. And
yeah, I mean, I think that's where the overarching, well, yeah, I mean, I think there's something very different and powerful, both the scope and the scale, but also I think the significance of the federal government demonstrating that it understands and takes responsibility and issuing policies that have a much broader effect. I guess I'm advocating for a both and approach. That is happening, and it provides a good anchor for the work that we're doing, and it paves a way for us to take local action that doesn't feel like it's a drop in the bucket. It feels like it's a much more significant thing that we're contributing to when we're doing it collectively, and when we know that the foundation has the potential to really be anchored by more sweeping changes, I think. Peter.
One thing it's I think worth mentioning is that, you know, when these original treaties were made, there was a trust fund established by which the people were going to be paid within the Department of the Interior. And most of those funds went missing. Eventually the tribe sued and there was a settlement Senator Salazar, who was from Colorado, eventually arranged a settlement. But this notion of reparations really is about funds that were promised. It wasn't really, I mean, I think that's an important context to recognize, that we realized that we owed for taking people's land many times at the time that those treaties were made. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that we just haven't paid those debts.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and there was a really interesting point. I didn't work this into my comments, but it was highlighted at the Day of Learning on Reparations that was hosted by the Reconstructing Judaism movement. And I'm not going to be able to remember the details, but there was a lawsuit, a significant lawsuit, where a very large payout was offered to a tribe, and they turned it down because they're not interested in the payment. They wanted their land back. So I have to get the exact example, and I'll try to remember to include the link. But there's also, I mean, I think resources and what they're attached to and financial resources are very important, but I think the importance of this work, of the importance of engaging with individual communities, is to learn what is necessary to repair the harm that was done, and whether that is in the form of payment that's attached to a land trust so that the tribe can buy back land, or if it's other significant measures. I mean, I think it's very context specific, and we hear a lot of cases where the tribe, well, this one particularly salient case, I'm being sloppy by raising it without having the exact reference, but I'll get that and share that as another good example. Okay, I note that we are at the top of the hour. We did block an hour and a half for this. For me, the time flew. I hope that it didn't drag on your side. But are there any last questions that folks want to throw out there before we sign off? All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for your engaged participation. And I hope this leads up to all kinds of good follow-up. I'll be looking forward to having those ongoing conversations with you. All right. Take care, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you so much.
What a great introduction. I'd love to follow up with you, Sarah.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it really was excellent, Sarah. You so knowledgeable and gracious and articulate. It's really a wonderful, hopefully be a starting point and a foundation for us to go further with this work.
Thanks. I'm going to turn the recording off now just so that we can stay on and continue to chat, but